welcome to this joint work session of the Eugene City Council and the Eugene Water and Electric Board of Commissioners. I now call the September 27th, 2021 City Council work session to order.
And good evening, everybody. I now call the September 27th, 2021 EWEB Board of Commissioners work session to order.
Thank you all for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using as our state and community recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. This format enables us to meet and take care of business while keeping everyone safe. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials webpage. And as always, other avenues of communication with me, the city councilors, and the commissioners are available, including email and voicemail. Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I am going to turn this over to City Manager Sarah Maderi.
Yeah. Thank you, Mayor Venice. Thank you all. I'm super excited to be here with you and another one of our joint meetings. I wanted to just say a couple of comments before I kick it over to Frank, because he's actually doing presentations. And that was really just about partnership. And I wanted to share with all of you that Frank was probably one of the first people that reached out to me when I was appointed pro tem city manager, and has been a great resource partner through all the last couple of years, through all the kind of the ups and downs, has been a constant resource and somebody that I can really rely on. So it's kind of like what you say on your trucks, you can rely on. So that's been really amazing. And I wanted to just give him that gratitude. We also have regular meetings between the City of Eugene, City Council, and EWEB Board of Commissioners leadership. So we meet and we talk about topics and talk about things that we have an interest in. And tonight's agenda really sort of emerged from those conversations. And I know not everybody gets to be a part of that, but tonight you'll start to get a glimpse of how the work we're doing overlaps and intersects and either can really help each other. So I just wanted to mention that and just say how much we're looking forward to hearing how you talk about this together and your conversations about how you hope to see us move work forward together, and just what's of interest to you, hopes and concerns, all of that. So I know we have a number of good topics. Frank is kicking off the first presentation, so I'm gonna just introduce Frank Lawson.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I would like to also echo my thanks to you and city management and staff for the ongoing relationship. You know, we work on so many things together, from climate to coordinating underground pipe and wire replacements with street resurfacing and all kinds of things. And it's really been a great partnership. And I've really enjoyed the last couple of years working with you. And then echo my thanks to the mayor and city leadership for our quarterly meetings. I think we get a lot of good notes and opportunities to discuss pressing issues. And so look forward to the discussion tonight as well. I guess I'm kicking off the presentation. Is that the schedule at this point? So I guess if someone can pull up the presentation, I'm not driving this, but doing the talking. So great. Mayor Venice, councilors, President Schlossberg, and commissioners, good evening. For the record, I am Frank Lawson, the general manager of EWEB, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Go ahead with the next slide, please. So councilors and commissioners, you were provided some background memos on the topic at hand, but I want to acknowledge kind of upfront that the presentation tonight might look and feel in essence like drinking from a fire hose. There's a lot of content here, and just wanted to acknowledge that up front. Go ahead with the next slide. I also want to recognize that there's a lot of good work and cooperation that's going on with EWEB and others, including the City of Eugene, Lane County. And we have some great partners, and I just wanted to say thank you to them as well. A number of them listed here that you recognize, and then some that you may not, because they're basically trade organizations that we work with also. Go ahead with slide 4, please. So thank you. I'd like to begin by establishing some benchmarks this evening and answering a few of the questions that have worked their way one way or another to me directly recently. First of all, we have built up debt to the climate, and we need to work our way out. The City of Eugene recognizes through your climate action plan work and EWEB through our strategic plan and values and climate change policy and many joint actions that we work with you, that we recognize that. Getting out of debt won't be easy. It will require us to work together. I think that was a statement from one of the counselors last week when referring to movements at the state and federal levels as well. The next three items pertain to how energy systems work. So for context, EWEB is reliant on a very large electric grid and indirectly on a gas grid. In both cases, we're small, less than 1% of the electric grid that's all interconnected. So from an absolute perspective, we're a bit insignificant in all that. Next slide. However, that grid is becoming increasingly constrained. Hydro conditions and operating requirements are changing. Firm and dispatchable resources like coal are being retired for good reason, with limited and not enough replacement. On your right is one indication of the sensitivity developing as a more and more scarcity and volatility starts to occur. If you look at the scale there, that's electric pricing that occurred this last February during a cold weather event. And normal prices, which would be $40 a megawatt hour, during that cold event went to over 300. And likely the carbon content shifted at the same time. So next slide. Simultaneously, we also know that carbon content of the grid does change seasonally and daily. In essence, the grid is more expensive and dirtier when at peak. And almost all studies are pointing toward capacity constraints, which is how we describe reliability in the future without some significant changes. And finally, I would like to reiterate the importance of energy efficiency, which is the last item there, and conservation. The cheapest and most carbon-free resource is the energy that's not used or not needed. Next slide, please. So speaking of our energy efficiency and conservation, your packets included basically a full roster of EWEB programs, both water and electricity. In addition to these programs, I would like to mention that later this year, we will be launching some new environmental products, including giving customers the ability to buy bulk renewable energy credits and carbon offsets that we hope eventually those offsets will be realized in our own watershed, which will provide the community a double benefit. As a result, our goal has been to offset organic sort of community growth over the last 10 years. And we've saved roughly 10,000 new megawatt hours per year. So when you compound that over the 10-year period, we've likely avoided over 100,000 metric tons of carbon over that time. Next slide, please. And go ahead and advance. Thank you. As for the impact of electrification, the study we published last year simply looked at the impacts of low, medium, and high rates of conversion or fuel switching of existing stock. So we were not looking at new construction. And the study showed that carbon savings, especially in electric mobility, and quantified the impacts of the EWEB system over the several decades predicted in that modeling. The diagram on the right shows that even with electric heating, carbon content still exists in the process because of how the electric grid functions. Much of the wasted energy showed is the inefficiency of converting from one fuel to another, natural gas or coal to electricity. What the study did not cover was the economics or the sensitivities to certain assumptions or changes in conditions. So next slide. The present, more enhanced study does evaluate the carbon and other economic impacts from three perspectives: the participant or the person who would make a decision to electrify, the customer owners of EWEB, and society. The full report will be presented to commissioners in November. The benefits and costs from each perspective is modeled over a 30-year time period. And in general, participants are weighing higher appliance costs versus fuel costs, while EWEB experiences incremental or marginal revenue increases from electrification, and society gets the benefit of avoided carbon emissions valued in our study at the social cost of carbon. What's not included is EWEB's long-term peaking or peak mitigation costs, which could impact the marginal value from an EWEB perspective. So next slide, please. Using the model, we summarized the results showing the carbon benefit value, which is the benefit or cost ratio for the three perspectives, the peak impacts on EWEB system, and how easily those peaks can be mitigated. It should be noted that some might feel looking at this that electrification is good, all electrification is good, given that sort of far left column there. But as a utility, we need to also consider the importance of reliability, affordability, and equity in those kinds of decisions. From this perspective, smart and therefore likely electrification reduces carbon emissions both reliably and affordably. So next slide, please. Applying that definition to the results starts to highlight the best opportunities and also eliminate others, and leads us to some high-level conclusions. So next slide, please. So from our modeling, anything and everything associated with the electrification of electric vehicles is good, as long as EWEB continues to mitigate the impacts of peak over time, which is achievable. Policies should continue to encourage off-peak convenience charging and enhance equitable access and more access to electric mobility. From a water heating perspective, electrification will be poor without strong incentives from the utility, so continued incentives are encouraged to facilitate further electrification of water heating. And then from a space heating perspective, we need to explore the options beyond the standard heat pump technology, potentially leveraging dual fuel technology, which is showing some interesting opportunities. And some additional supporting policies and opportunities are also listed here to be considered in a later discussion as relating to these conclusions. Next slide, please. So finally, I wanted to answer head on what seems to be the question of the day. For both EWEB commissioners and council, I'll give you my perspective on the impacts of gas infrastructure and some decisions related to that. So please consider these perspectives are unweighted. I'm not making a recommendation to prioritize one aspect over another. In general, EWEB, as I mentioned earlier, is insignificant when it comes to the grid, and we also have an obligation to serve whatever load is electrified. And I think that is something that needs to be understood. Although utilities are not known for their speed, we will also have time to respond to gradual electrification. However, given that much natural gas load is aligned with electric grid's peak, this would have detrimental impact on price, carbon, and the reliability of the grid that is already becoming more stressed. From a broader perspective, most electrification does provide carbon emission savings, along with impacts on local housing, local business economies, and the bills of those who can probably least afford it. Electricity is more expensive than natural gas from a utility bill perspective, and these bills are regressive. And the cost increases will exaggerate the inequities that already exist with energy burdened customers. So rather than leave you though with a little kind of a doom and gloom approach to this, I'd also like to offer up for EWEB commissioners and counselors to consider and maybe discuss later an option. So go ahead with the next slide. This concept will be a mix of two opportunities that could put Eugene in a leadership position. Kind of hope you recognize this as more of a carbon policy than a fuel policy. And part of the concept has been done in Canada with some immediate 70% reductions in natural gas use wherever it was applied. Granted, there's some differences in climate between Canada and Eugene, while the other part creates a kind of you get what you measure carbon reduction method. This approach is to focus on reducing the carbon intensity of energy delivered. The first piece involves the exploration of a dual fuel agreement between Northwest Natural and EWEB. And the second piece is to evolve building standards around energy And this part has some similarities to, I think, what Commissioner McCrae and Josh Scove proposed at least a couple of years ago. So there's some elements of that included in this approach. My specific ask tonight is for about 6 weeks. I have explored the rough idea with a few people, including Northwest Natural, who are interested in the concept. And if you like the proposal at that time, we could do a winter pilot and present the results next March, either proving or disproving that we can find a path to decarbonize faster and more equitably while minimizing the impacts on reliability and cost. And so next slide. And so that was the electrification. I was going to ask if you wanted me to do the water stuff right now, or you want me to save that for later.
My intention was to have we would have a discussion on electrification and then do the water, just because I think the question and answer might flow better. And so if that works for the rest of you. And I will just say, first of all, thank you. And secondly, just say to all of you that the plan is, as we have done with other joint elected officials meetings, we'll take turns, City Council and EWEB commissioners. Everybody gets 2 minutes in that first round. And then a reminder that we actually have a second topic. And so I will try to hold you to that, hold the discussion so that we can get to the second topic as well. And President Schlossberg and I will keep our respective cues. So with
Mayor, I think we were planning to have Chelsea provide the climate action update.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
I'm jumping on the script, so I will turn that over to Chelsea in that case. Thank you.
And Mayor, this is Matt. I apologize to interject like this, but I've been receiving communication from constituents who echo Rod's communication in the chat that there's no meeting being shown online, that there's a link that there may be a technical issue that the public may not be able to fully engage or participate at this juncture. So I just want to flag that for staff on the back end, please.
Thank you, Councillor Keating. We are working on that.
Okay, thank you. So now I will turn it over to Chelsea.
Thank you, Mayor. Just get my slides up. All right. Let's see. I can see Councillor Ye. Can you just nod your head if you can see my slides? Thank you. All right. Good evening. Thank you for having me here. My name is Chelsea Clinton. I'm the Sustainability Manager with the City of Eugene. And thank you, Frank, for all that information. It's a lot to consider and digest. I really appreciated hearing all of it from you. Today, I'll give a quick overview of the city's climate recovery ordinance, the climate action plan 2.0, and I'll wrap up by highlighting some of the collaborations happening between EWEB and the City of Eugene. All right, so first the CRO, or the climate recovery ordinance. The CRO includes 4 goals summarized on your screen. So the first is carbon neutrality in city operations by 2020. The second, reduce fossil fuel use in city operations by 50% by 2030 compared to 2010. The third, reduce fossil fuel use community-wide by 50% by 2030 compared to 2010. And the last, reduce community-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 7.6% annually, or by about 64% annually by 2030. I won't talk more about the first 2 goals after this slide. So I'll mention that the city purchased carbon offsets to cover emissions from 2020 to meet this goal. You can read more about that in the Eugene Climate Connection newsletter, which is linked there on the slides. And the remainder of our conversation will really focus on primarily on goal 4, which overlaps really heavily with goal 3. This graph is one way to track our progress in meeting our community-wide CRO emissions reduction goals. The solid green line on the left shows our emissions from 2010 to 2017, and the car shows our 2019 emissions. That's our last data point. You'll notice that it's tracking fairly closely with our business as usual forecast line, the dashed orange line to the right, and the bottom dashed green line reflects our CRO goal. Eugene's Community Climate Action Plan 2.0, or the CAP 2.0, is the city's roadmap to reaching our community CRO goals. City Council adopted the CAP 2.0 in the summer of 2020 after more than 2 years of process that included extensive data analysis and community engagement. It includes 115 actions contributed by the City of Eugene and the Eugene Climate Collaborative partners, including EWEB. And I'll talk more about the Eugene Climate Collaborative a little bit later, but for now, know that it's 12 community organizations that operate at a systems level and really have the ability to impact our community as we try and reach our climate goals at a systems level. The CAP 2.0 also includes 25 state and federal actions, 41 equity panel recommendations, 72 ideas for additional action from the community, and 6 community engagement initiatives. When you look through the CAP 2.0 and we talk about our local emissions, the emissions that we emit in our geographic boundary, we use this framework, the buckets, to summarize their sources. So the transportation bucket, as you can see, is about 53% of our emissions, and most of those emissions come from gasoline and diesel fuel. Second, the building energy bucket is about 32% of our emissions, and most of those emissions come from electricity and natural gas. And last, fugitive emissions is about 15% of our emissions, and those emissions come from waste and refrigerant leakage. So today I'll provide an overview of the work that's going on in our transportation and building energy buckets, because that's where most of the overlap happens between our two organizations. So first, the transportation bucket. If you look at the CAP 2.0, most of the actions in this bucket address either the Eugene's transportation system plan, Envision Eugene, or land use planning, and electric vehicles. Today, I'll focus on the TSP as well as the electric vehicle strategy, again, because that's where our work aligns most closely. So the TSP, or the Transportation System Plan, is the backbone of the CAP 2.0. If implemented, our modeling shows that it could lead to significant annual emissions reductions north of 200,000 metric tons carbon equivalent annually. We plan to update the TSP in 2022 to better align it with the city's climate goals and to better understand what transportation projects and programs we need to implement in order to achieve the city's fossil fuel reduction and emissions reduction goals. And with this update, we'll analyze potential emissions reduction from walking, biking, and transit infrastructure projects, as well as potential reductions from programming and regulations that encourage people to drive less as part of that update process. In EVs, the city has an electric vehicle strategy that we have posted online and is linked in this slide. This strategy represents a multifaceted approach to increasing electric mobility in Eugene, including EVs, electric bikes, and other forms of electric mobility. As a few examples I'll share will demonstrate, this is an area of really high collaboration between our two organizations, and we're really grateful for this partnership. So some of the things we've been working on at the city are hosting online workshops on buying EVs and e-bikes, developing comprehensive online resources for people interested in EVs and e-bikes, working with EWEB and Fourth Mobility to bring forth electric car share vehicles to Eugene, including at affordable housing sites, supporting LTD's efforts to transition its fleet to electric buses, preparing for potential state and federal grant funding for EV charging infrastructure, and again, working with EWEB to investigate the potential to install EV charging in the right-of-way, and last, preparing for a shared e-scooter program to be launched next spring. And then next, building energy. As I mentioned before, emissions from building energy bucket come from natural gas and electricity. The CAP 2.0 specifically references EWEB's electricity supply plan as a guiding policy for our community's climate action. EWEB's low carbon electricity provides community members in Eugene a climate friendly energy source today, something many communities do not have access to. One way that the city of Eugene and EWEB are collaborating to lower emissions is in our building stock is via CAP Action B2. We're developing a report to show how increased investments from the city could further leverage EWEB's incentives to support energy efficiency and potential electrification in the community. This will build on an existing partnership between the city's affordable housing team and EWEB, which already work together to find ways to leverage each organization's resources to improve energy efficiency in community projects. Another example of collaboration between our organizations is the SCORE program. For several years, EWEB, the University of Oregon, and the city have supported the SCORE program, which trains students as energy specialists to conduct home energy score audits, specifically in low-income and rental units. After conducting the audits, property owners receive a report that provides estimated energy costs and a list of recommended improvements. The report also provides households with low-cost ways to lower their bills. For property owners, this home energy score is a great way to promote the energy updates they've made to their rental or to get a plan for future upgrades. Related to that, the city will consider implementing a mandatory home energy score at the point of sale of a home this fall. The program will use the same type of energy audit used by the SCORE program and will offer potential home buyers information about energy use and options to improve the home's energy performance. City Council will be receiving more information on this item in November, including the next steps needed to move forward on a mandatory program. And last, just to switch gears a bit, I did want to mention that the city has been negotiating a natural gas franchise renewal and climate agreement with Northwest Natural. That process began in late 2019. After several extensions, Northwest Natural's franchise with the city lapsed in May of 2021, but Northwest Natural and the city are still collaborating. Northwest Natural is currently preparing to file a voluntary emissions reduction program under SB 844 with the Oregon Public Utilities Commission, and the city is its key stakeholder in that process. And at this time, the hope is to complete that filing by the end of the calendar year. I promised I would talk more about the Eugene Climate Collaborative early in the presentation, or the ECC. The ECC includes 12 organizations, including the city and EWEB, that have significant oversight and impact on community-wide fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions, or have the ability to affect or alter systems that will enable the community to adapt and prepare for climate change. You can see each of the organizations' logos on the screen. We brought the ECC together to support the CAP 2.0 planning process, and we are still continuing to meet now as we work to implement climate solutions for our community. We have staff groups currently meeting to discuss building electrification, decarbonization, and energy efficiency, as well as carbon offsets. And we have plans to start an additional 3 staff groups this year, one around transportation, electrification, and decarbonization, one around sustainability and equity, and the last around climate resiliency. In addition, the executives from all of these organizations are meeting periodically to affirm each organization's commitment to climate action and to continue to learn from each other. In this slide, I give a couple more examples of our partnerships between our 2 organizations. EWEB has supported the city on a number of recent building upgrades and facilities projects. On the left-hand side on the screen, you can see a picture of the new electric heat pump being placed on the Echo Hollow Community Center as part of the pool renovation there. EWEB provided an incentive of about $115,000 for a variety of energy efficiency and electrification measures at that project. Our projections show that these features will lead to about a 64% reduction in energy use compared to the previous Echo Hollow facility, or about a 300 metric ton carbon equivalent reduction annually. And a similar project is currently underway at Sheldon. In the picture on the right, the city's public works team just finished installing new lamps in the downtown globe lights. The new lights are programmed to come on at sunset with a warm glow, increase the brightness at 10 p.m. and again at 2 a.m., enhancing security as well as taking into account energy efficiency. The project included replacing more than 300 lights and is expected to reduce energy use by more than 40%. EWEB contributed about $10,000 to this project through their incentives. Last, here's an overview of the city's planned fall work sessions related to our climate and sustainability work. As you can see, climate will be a very common topic. We're looking forward to robust conversations at the City Council table and in our community over the next few months as we consider a variety of strategies that will help us meet our climate goals. With that, I'll turn it back over to the mayor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for that presentation. I don't want to use too much time with comments, so I have Matt Keating. I had you with a cue. Did you take your hand down? Okay.
I did,
Good.
Mayor. I'm formulating my questions. It was mostly to
Okay.
just inform staff about the technical issue.
All right, so I have Mike up first, and then we'll take an EWEB commissioner.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. I just had a few folks in and out of my house here. Sorry about that. I appreciate all the presentations, and Frank and commissioners, I appreciate very much the work that EWEB has done to try and answer some really difficult questions here. First off, Frank, talk to me a little bit more about peak demand and reliability. One of the things I noticed there in the presentation was, unless I got this really wrong, you talking about high peak time having a 700% difference in cost. Can you talk more about that?
So yes, Councilor, I can. So there's a number of things driving, I'll call it the volatility and uncertainty in the grid. So we're a little bit unusual in the country. We have a lot of hydro. Hydro is not as prolific in other parts of the country. There are a number of different things affecting the future of hydro. One is the climate itself, which is starting to restrict water. Now, the Columbia Basin is a lot better than the Cascades, but there's still some future predictions that will diminish. And the other one is just operating conditions. So fish and wildlife restrictions are reducing the capacity of the system to respond. And I would be really clear to say that we're talking about capacity. We're not talking about average altitude. We're talking about the ability to go over and fly over the mountains. And that's the piece that is of most concern. When you take out things that are dispatched by humans, like coal, for example, and you replace it with intermittent resources like wind and solar, and there's very good reasons to do that, you create volatility in your ability to work and manage those peaks. So that scarcity will drive up prices. I suspect that capacity pricing will continue to increase relative to average pricing. And also at some point, we are concerned that we're just not going to build enough resource or enough transmission to respond. So there's a reliability and a pricing concern.
And that was my next question with regard to reliability. As demand increases from other parts of the grid and other locales, and our capacity to serve it locally and or not be able to the transmission difficulties that happen from our increase in electrification, can you talk about reliability as it pertains to, like, California seeing blackouts as they do, or managed brownouts, or however you want to describe it?
Right. The best way to leverage the diversity of wind and solar and other resources is to geographically be diverse as well. That's going to require additional transmission, and transmission is not easy or quickly built. I would describe the old days that there was a complete surplus of energy in the Northwest, and when California needed it, especially in the summer, a lot of energy flowed to California. And when we were colder in the Northwest, energy flowed the other way. Because it's now integrated, we are starting to see more and more constraints. We are very lucky that the heat dome that at the end of June was not, it was not simultaneous to a heat wave in California and the desert Southwest, or it could have caused some supply issues. Those will first manifest themselves as pricing excursions, which we're seeing. I describe those as heart palpitations, if you want to classify them that way. And later, if we don't build out transmission and further resource, we will end up in a similar condition with California or Texas or some of the other examples. So we do need to increase our build out of resource. And that's without electrification, by the way. So
that's what I was just going to ask.
I mean, it can be managed. I don't want to make it sound like it can't be managed, but the difficult one is the one that builds on peak. And space heating in particular is the one that builds on peak.
So my question about the reliability, will we see California blackouts in here at the pace we're on or at the pace of complete electrification if it doesn't match well with the scope of being able to increase capacity construction?
That's a big hypothetical question. I would say there's a number of things that are going to affect this over the next 5 to 8 years. One of them is, we're part of the Bonneville system. Bonneville would likely violate environmental laws to keep the grid on. At some point, it starts as pricing. They would probably violate some of their fish and wildlife flow restrictions if they had to keep the lights on. I wouldn't necessarily expect in the next 5 to 8 years that happens. Starting to look beyond that, if we don't build out resources, it's an issue of risk. We're putting ourselves at greater and greater risk. And the models that we're seeing kind of across the Northwest reinforce that under low hydro conditions, extreme temperatures, and other sort of load excursions, the probability of at least sort of rolling conditions like that, where we would have to curtail load, are increasing.
We already know about the pricing differential. Can you talk about the carbon intensity differential of highest peak delivery?
Yeah, it's, and I'll use the grid numbers. I think they were on one of the slides. They tend to be multiple times higher during those peak periods. You're generally turning on resources that are thermal resources. And so when the wind isn't blowing and the sun's not shining and you're in a peak condition, carbon resources are used more during those times. I don't remember the exact multiplier, but it's several times dirtier during peak than it is sort of on average, especially in the Northwest with a good hydro base.
Natural gas is used to produce electricity at, a small amount during regular times, but would it be fair to say at peak times it might even be close to 80%?
You kind of broke up at the beginning of your question. I didn't hear it all.
I said we know that it's a minor amount during normal times, but at peak times, would it be fair to say it approaches 80%?
I would have to check on the exact number, Counselor. So the way that the resource base works is that natural gas will peak during time. It's really temperature driven. And so a majority of the natural gas use is going to be when you in the winter, when you need to have peaking conditions, and a large amount of supply, just energy in general, is supplied by natural gas in the winter. It's more peaky than electricity, for example, from a base load perspective. I don't know what the exact percentage would be.
And lastly, did your studies talk about alternatives the general public might use? In other words, burning gas generators in times of grid failure?
No, it did not look at that.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I just want to alert everyone, I've got a long list of folks needing to speak. And so if we can keep it a little tight, that will be helpful so everyone gets a chance. And I turn it over to Mindy for the commissioners.
Great. All right. So commissioners, I'm going to assume that everybody has something to say, but if you don't, then if I call on you, then you can just pass. But the first round, I'm going to start with Commissioner McCray, and then our next go through, it'll be Commissioner Brown, because those are the hands I see raised.
Thanks, President Schlossberg. First, thanks for the presentation, Frank. I do want to clarify that the solution that Josh Scove and I proposed called for tapering out fossil fuel gas over 30 years. It absolutely didn't suggest anyone invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure. And though I haven't looked closely at the pilot project that Frank just proposed, I don't expect it will be something that I can get behind. I also want to say that the argument that Eugene is a tiny contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions is accurate, but in my opinion, not relevant. It's precisely the fact that every community can make the same argument that we are in the pickle we're in my opinion, it is our responsibility to address our emissions while others work on addressing theirs. Question for Frank. If there was a new policy that required all new buildings in Eugene to run on electricity, and we're talking about just new buildings, not retrofitting all the existing buildings. My dog's chiming in. Do you know how much additional load would result?
Commissioner McCray, we didn't look at that specifically on our studies. I know that we do about, on average, about 750 or so new connections every year. So I would have to go back and run that calculation.
Okay. Given it's just an incremental increase each year, isn't it a fairly minimal additional load?
Yeah, I would say, in
EWEB
fact, my point about being sort of insignificant wasn't relative to carbon as much as it was relative to the grid. So, I absolutely believe we all have to work together on the carbon side. From a grid perspective, EWEB and Eugene is pretty insignificant as far as its impact. If you aggregate that though, and you do say that, talk about electrification or impacts on the grid, the issue of contributing to peak, even if it's small, is detrimental to the other side of that equation. But I didn't mean to imply that we're not significant in the fight against climate change.
Thanks for the clarification. We have 30 years to make the transition to electrified buildings or buildings that don't run on fossil gas. Doesn't that give us sufficient time to plan and build sufficient resources to meet that new demand?
It gives us a lot of time to work on that. The issue with me on the whole relationship between by the way, I don't look at fossil gas the same as I look at gas. So gas in general. I do believe that at some point we will continue to need both, but the fossilness of that gas will be eliminated. I believe that it's going to take both.
Yeah, I would love to see Northwest Natural lean into that and provide renewable gas. I don't see any indication that they're going to go that way. Okay, my last question, and thanks for the time here. Even if we use high carbon electricity during peak, as you and Councilor Clark were just discussing, aren't the overall emissions lower if we use electricity for a heating in our region? And doesn't the carbon intense peak diminish as we build new renewable resources?
So I don't know that they would diminish as we build renewable resources. I do think that if you're talking about how you would most effectively meet peak from a cost and carbon perspective, a direct use fuel would be better than converting to electricity and losing the efficiency of the conversion. The whole concept behind sort of the dual energy concept that I mentioned was that you're no longer, the only time you're using natural gas is you're sipping natural gas during those times when you absolutely need it. The rest of it, the average use, the average consumption drops significantly. And so what you're doing is you're picking the most effective, most efficient, most carbon-free way to meet that peak energy demand under those conditions. And so that's the concept. And at the same time that you're decarbonizing the electric grid, you're decarbonizing or defossilizing the gas grid.
I hope that's how that works out. Thanks for the answers, and I'll wrap up. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Mr. Lawson and Chelsea, for your presentations. I think we're all concerned about being good stewards of our planet. I think we're all concerned about climate change. It's a matter of how we make our transitions and pace and timing for me that I'm interested in. And I don't want to beat up on hydro capacity. I think Councilor Clark did a good job of trying to drill down into that issue. However, I will say that I'm very interested if we can get any more detail before City Council starts weighing in on some pretty significant issues of what the reduction from Fish and Wildlife, the courts, and our drought conditions are going to have on hydroelectric generation. At the same time, I also wanted to ask a question about solar. It doesn't seem like we're putting a lot of energy into that. And I've actually heard some people say, well, our climate isn't conducive to solar. However, I just got back from Germany and Switzerland. And in Germany, the climate where I was at was very similar to our area. In fact, it looked like the Willamette Valley. And everywhere I looked, there were solar panels. I was absolutely blown away by the amount of solar generation capacity they have. Have we looked at that anymore, Mr. Lawson?
Yes, Counselor. So most of the studies that I've seen have a few things in common. One of them do indicate that there is a need, even in the Northwest, and you consider the Northwest a fairly broad footprint, to build out more renewables, including solar. So including wind, including solar. The need is there to build those out. All of those studies do also indicate that there's a capacity issue, and there's another way that you're going to have to develop dispatchable fuels. I would say that there's a number of things that EWEB has to do to facilitate that. A number of those have to relate to how we do our pricing of our product and how we capture fixed costs versus variable costs and other things. But I do agree that more wind, more solar is needed throughout the Pacific Northwest, really the West Coast. That's where you leverage your diversity, as well as one of the big missing pieces that right now is very expensive, but also very important, is storage. And that's something that we need some innovation on, and we need some economics to help that situation.
Thank you. And just as you're planning out your new reservoirs, I had an opportunity to tour the Hawkins and 25th Avenue site, and it dawned on me, there's such a large space that's buffered by trees. Are we giving any consideration to engineering the roof structures so that they could, at least in the future, hold solar panels? Because the footprint can't be really used for anything else.
I don't know that that's been in our design criteria, Counselor. I'd have to get back to you on that.
I would appreciate that. And then my last question is around hydrogen production and efforts that I know EWEB's been in some discussions with Northwest Natural. Could you touch on that briefly?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So both Northwest Natural and EWEB are interested in hydro production. From our perspective, when you build out wind and solar, you have to achieve the same reliability, you have to build out wind and solar somewhere between 5 and 8 times greater than you do what you take out or what you replace. That naturally creates times of surplus, and to make this whole effort more affordable so that the electric grid can decarbonize, we need to find a secondary market for the times when you have surplus as opposed to curtail it. One of those potential opportunities is the production of hydrogen. It's a stored fuel. It can be re-injected into the gas system to decarbonize it directly. And it is one of the pieces to moving from fossil fuel to synthetic fuel. With some other technologies, at some point, we could get rid of fossil fuels altogether, use the surplus from wind and solar. So that's our interest, as well as storage, as well as talking with people like LTD about fuel cell vehicles, which are also carbon free. And then also as a means of resiliency, instead of having diesel generators as backup, it'd be better to have fuel cells. So we have multiple interests.
Thank you. And I'm out of time. Appreciate your responses.
All right. Commissioner Brown, you're going to be next. And at our next go around, it'll be Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. And thank you, Council, for this meeting. I really think they're productive. Chelsea, I just have a real quick question about your slide that talked about the carbon coming from electricity loss to the buildings. Could you elaborate on that, what that particular, you said the carbon entering is second behind transportation from buildings, and it's about 32%, I thought. What is that about the electricity sector? What amount of carbon is perceived to enter the environment through electricity loss in buildings? What is that source, carbon source in the electricity grid?
You know, Frank is probably better positioned to me to talk about the carbon sources within the electricity grid, but we just know that EWEB's electricity, like all electricity, has some amount of a carbon footprint within it. It's very small from EWEB. In particular for the city, we look at EWEB's emission factor rather than I know sometimes folks look at the Northwest Power Pool, but Frank, feel free to chime in. I know that 80% of your electricity is carbon free, and you could probably speak more about the particular elements that aren't.
Yeah, Commissioner Brown, this is one of those questions where it's oftentimes, will the real number please stand up? Because there's a lot of different ways to look at this. I tend to look at this from a regional perspective. So I tend to use either the Western Interconnect or the Northwest Power Pool for what I consider to be the most accurate way of carbon accounting. In the grid itself, there's a number of sources. We still have coal in the system. We need to get that out. And from EWEB's perspective, what's called unspecified market purchases get a carbon number assigned to them. So there is still carbon in the grid. In fact, I think one of the highest uses of natural gas in the Northwest is electricity generation. So, which is not very efficient. So, that's where the carbon comes from as far as Northwest.
Okay, thank you. And then could you, to expand on that, I thought I heard 80%. I thought we were more like 90%, and that does not include the percentage of Bonneville that's nuclear because it's carbon free, but it's not renewable. And so what is our true carbon, if we're 90% carbon free on our standard portfolio, and then if we count the nuclear that is in Bonneville's portfolio, what is the true carbon free portfolio of 100%? What is that percentage?
So I'll describe EWEB's number as what we put into the grid. It's not what we take out. So just to be clear, we are 90% carbon free. That does include nuclear as being carbon free. What is in that last 10%? There are some thermal resources, and I'll give one example. And one example is Seneca. Seneca is considered renewable by Oregon standards, but is not necessarily carbon free. And so it's about, I think it's about 6%. And then most of the remainder is what are classified as those unspecified market purchases. That's just assigned a number from the grid, depending on Bonneville's numbers over the years and other things. So 90% carbon free is what I would consider what we put into the grid. And that varies year to year, mostly because of weather conditions and hydro levels. So in a good hydro year, we will have less carbon in the system. In a bad hydro year, we will have more carbon in the system. So,
and to kind of piggyback on Councilor Grove's question about the hydro supply, if the Snake River dams are eliminated and or the Chinook salmon are taken from threatened to endangered, what does that do to our electric capacity, our ability to have hydro, because we're so hydro dependent on our ability to generate?
So I'll say, and I'll strictly speak from the electricity perspective. When you start removing hydro and hydro storage in particular, you reduce our capacity to respond to events and produce carbon-free resources. That's independent of the fish examples as well. So it puts pressure on the remaining part of the system. I will say that it is going to get more complicated. It is going to be regulated more, and there's no signs that environmental regulations on dams and other things is going to get easier, not harder. The state of Oregon is part of a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit, which is challenging the spill regimes on the Columbia. That will have impacts if that goes through. More water will be spilled and less will be used for generation. And that's to protect endangered fish. So all of those have negative impacts on the system's ability relative to capacity.
Okay, and lastly, we're experiencing having to deal with the federal government on redoing the Lieberg facility, and they're making us plan and design and construct for a 1 in a million year event. How, if that is carried on to other hydro generation facilities, how will that also affect our ability to produce non-carbon electricity?
The decision for the various hydro producers, I think, Commissioner, would not be one of I think it would be a lot like, I think we're going to have to look at this, which is how do we replace the profile of those resources, which is the carbon content, the dispatchability, and then what is the trade-off between cost of continuing to invest in a hydro facility versus investing in a combination of wind and solar and batteries and potentially other technologies. So I have a feeling they would look at it the same way, and start to make investment choices based on some other criteria. Some of those standards are getting more difficult, which is unfortunately making hydro less attractive as a generating resource. And I think that another example of that is discussions about changing the federal licenses on Cougar Reservoir and on the Sandy Am as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Thanks, Mayor. So also I will put in my thanks. I appreciate everyone's time to be here tonight. I think it's very important. Councilor Groves actually started touching on what I was interested in, which was to talk a little bit about your plans with solar. And so I want to make sure the way I understood what you were saying is that you have there's storage issues. I assume that means battery storage issues for storing the excess electricity when you're getting it, so that you can then use it later. And that's one of the reasons why you're interested in hydrogen. Is that correct?
That's part of it, yes.
So I'm wondering if you can, because I mean, solar seems like a really good idea to me. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the battery issue very quickly, and I guess the impression I'm getting is that EWEB is not interested in pushing the idea of solar, but maybe maybe I'm not understanding.
So I don't know that you're understanding that quite correctly. And they are interrelated, but they're separate issues. So I think when you look at solar, most of our incentives around solar have to do with installation incentives. So we provide installation incentives to put in solar. Part of the issue with solar is related to the payback of solar relative to what the utility buys back the power for. There's a cost of service and a pricing issue that we particularly will probably have to address in the next couple of years if we want more investment for customers to get a return on that investment. So that's sort of an administrative structural issue that EWEB has. From a storage perspective, that's not unique to solar. I think that if you look at intermittent resources in general, they all have their different profiles. You know, Bend solar is different from Eugene solar. Mackenzie or Gorge wind is different than Montana wind. So looking at all those combinations, we will need storage in general. And bulk storage is still very, very expensive and kind of unpractical, and doesn't seem to be practical in the future. So we do need a different kind of storage, and hydrogen is just one potential option for that. But that's a little bit of a separate issue.
Okay. My second thing was, it sounds like we have some very similar priorities. You were talking about EV conversion being something you think is very worthwhile, and the city's been talking about that. Energy efficiency. That's another thing we've been talking a lot about. I was very impressed with your residential and your business program that you have for folks, and looking at that. And I think there's got to be some great places in here that maybe we can collaborate on when we're doing our investments. Why, we can do it together. And I'm sure Chelsea is going to be bringing some of that back to us, because that's one of the things we were interested in. So I think that's great that we're kind of on the same page. So the last, I can't remember if it's the last slide or close to the last slide. Oh, I'm out of time. I'm sorry. Never mind.
Okay. Oh.
Great. I think that it is our turn, and Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentations. As EWEB commissioners, we're pretty familiar with our electrification study, and you guys are more familiar with your studies. So I'm going to lean into some of yours. For me, there's a couple of things that jump out as areas that I would like to work on collaboration between the city and EWEB. One of them would be efficiencies. You know, Frank talked about that. That's the most bang for the buck, is efficiencies. And one of the major stumbling blocks to that is that 50% of our housing stock is rentals. Now, you know, Chelsea talked about that we can do an energy score and say, yes, it's cheaper to live in this apartment as opposed to that apartment. But as Matt can attest, just finding an apartment right now is hard enough. Less, you know, saying I'm not going to move into this one because it's going to cost me $20 a month more for electricity. So figuring out a way to incentivize landlords to weatherize and use efficiencies, I think, is one of a big thing that we could work on together. The other thing that I'm very hopeful that we can work together on is the carbon offsets and the ability for us to work together. If the city of Eugene is buying carbon offsets and we have an ability down the road of setting up carbon offsets in our watershed, so that the money that the city is spending on carbon offsets is also helping to protect our watershed, is something that I really hope we can pursue in the next few years. You know, I looked at that slide that Chelsea put up and showed where we are, and we're not going towards where we're going, which means we're going to have to buy more and more carbon offsets if we're going to hit those numbers. And if that money is going to out of state, I would like to really pursue trying to get it used in our neighborhood. So that's some of the things I'd like to see us working on together.
Thank you. Claire.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Frank, very much for the presentation, and Chelsea for the recap of our work. I have some comments and questions. So I agree your statement at the beginning, Frank, that the cheapest, most environmentally friendly energy is that which is never consumed. So I really appreciate Commissioner Borowski's comments, and I love that framing. As we look at how we can move to energy delivery that's less carbon intensive, I believe we have to acknowledge that we've been pretty spoiled here in this region in terms of access to relatively cheap energy, and we will likely need to make some adjustments in our expectations in terms of pricing and accessibility. But if we take an informed and deliberate approach, I don't think we have to head down the road that's going to result in rolling blackouts. And the recent blackouts in California were to avoid starting fires, not because they couldn't deliver the energy. So let's not conflate those things. And then Frank, you used the high peak time of an extreme weather event, not just average peak demand. So what is the difference when we are not experiencing weather event between, you know, average demand and peak?
So Councilor, thanks for the question. So we do so just a little bit about how we do utility planning when it comes to peak events. We, for planning purposes, use a 1 in 10 event as our planning criteria, and that's primarily for reliability. The event that I showed was actually not that extreme. That was last February. I have lots of other examples that look very similar to that. So that, you know, it's maybe not a 1 in 2, sort of a standard winter, but we see pretty clear alignment between peak pricing and scarcity, and also the carbon that would be used to generate those. And so those are pretty direct relationships. I can actually pull the data and show you. I would say in general, it's pretty routine that you'll see a 2 times carbon content, even throughout the course of a day, peak versus off peak. And then weather events, it is pretty nominal to see prices that range from $20 to $60. So a 3-fold increase just in the course of a day or two all the time. The 300 was definitely, it wasn't an excursion per se, it wasn't unusual. It was just one that I picked as an example.
But it was, and how long did that peak last?
That one was off and on for probably 3 or 4 days. We also, for example, we saw some pretty interesting temperatures throughout sort of the latter half of August. We saw something that looked very much like that, only it was every day for about 2 weeks. We also saw very similar effects at the heat dome. So it really, and I actually would expect as a result of climate change that we see more variability in our weather patterns, which doesn't really help that. So it wasn't actually that unusual. And I can definitely pull more data if you want to get a feel for that.
Thank you. So I just, we just can't be using our worst case scenarios as our baseline. And then this new dual fuel proposal on your last slide is a total surprise out of left field. It wasn't mentioned in our recent meetings with you to prepare for this joint meeting. And it feels like a big sales pitch to assist Northwest Natural in avoiding action from the city council to start limiting their expansion. And I have to say, I'm left extremely skeptical of it, given our history of trying to work in collaboration with Northwest Natural. I have real reservations about the idea of our publicly owned and governed utility partnering with a private profit motive driven energy company. And when that occurred with the Seneca Biofuels plant, did not go well for public ratepayers. So this is probably not a project I'm going to be able to buy into.
Okay, it's back to us. Commissioner Carlson.
Great, thank you very much. I really appreciate the meeting and actually some of Councilor Surratt's questions partner well with the line of questioning that I have. So, I mean, when we're talking about peak demand, there are a few times of year when we have peaks. I do recognize that we will have more of those kind of peak times, but I don't want that to delay the work that we need to do critically around energy efficiency in buildings, around fuel switching. You know, the slide that Frank presented that talks about electric vehicles, heat pumps, and small office space heat it seems like those are some of the options potentially. I'm also skeptical of some of the dual heat pump conversation. I do want to see more data. I'd also like to see more about what Northwest Natural is actually able to, how they're able to decarbonize. I mean, are they truly decarbonizing by doing more methane capture on like landfills? And so that's actually having a negative impact on the carbon that's being released into the atmosphere. How quickly can they, and what is the true amount of availability of methane out there to capture to make that switch? I do recognize that, you know, as a society, we have a certain amount of energy resources, and we need to, you know, figure out how we can use the least carbon intensive during the times when we have those available, and then potentially during those peak times use potentially those more carbon intensive resources for reliability perspective. I mean, when we have times where we have extreme freezing conditions or extreme heat conditions, that's going to result in loss of life. I mean, when we had 115 degree weather here, I mean, people really do truly die during those sorts of situations. So those are the times when I think as a society, we need to figure out how to ration those. And I know the work that we're doing at EWEB is around figuring out how to provide those resources to, and I'm already over, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, I'm sorry about that. So I'll wrap it up, but I do hope that we are able to get more of those resources together as a city and EWEB specifically.
Thank you. Greg.
Thanks, Mayor, and I want to thank the staff for all of this work. I have a few quick questions. The first one is EV stations. We know we're behind in terms of installing EV stations, but what is the plan for that? And who is going to control it? Will it be the public, or will it be a private entity that enters into this and takes control of it? Because you know they're going to want to make, somebody's going to want to make money off of this.
So
I think that's for Frank.
I'll give you my perspective, and then Chelsea can weigh in as well. I think there's actually opportunity for both. We have funding to look at some direct EWEB charging potentially, and also providing incentives for third parties to also provide charging. So I don't think this is an either or. I think it's probably a both in this case.
Well, how do we control consumer prices in that area?
So if it could, we actually, I don't know that EWEB can actually control that. Now, they cannot market energy, but they could market the connectivity to a charging station if they wanted to. I guess that would not be within sort of EWEB's ability to control, other than our own stations.
This one might be a combined response. Dark zones. What I mean by dark zones is there are certain places in the city that do not have sufficient overhead light at night for people to travel. If I'm traveling on Highway 99 and somebody's dressed in black clothes, I might hit him, or if I don't see him come up that quickly. There are several areas like that. I'm not just talking about my area, but several streets like that. And, I thought we had gotten past the old South Carolina dirt road deal years ago. Is there other technology available? I mean, can we use the existing infrastructure that we have to create better lighting?
I don't have the answer to that, but I think Matt Rodriguez is in the attendees. I'm just kind of curious if he wants to jump in on both your previous question or this one. We're able to pull him over.
Well, you could respond to me in the chat. I have one last question because I know I'm running out of time. The grid. How old is the grid? And what is going to be needed to upgrade the grid so that we can have some reliability in terms of our energy sources? And what is the security to keep people, hackers, whether they're the Russians, the Chinese, or just some dude in his underwear, breaking into the system and shutting it down and screwing us up bad for a long time?
So the grid, like a lot of infrastructure, Counselor, is in various states of aging. There was a lot of infrastructure built out in the sort of mid 20th century, late 20th century. Much of that is aging. There are all kinds of threats. The cyber threats is one of them. The grid needs significant. The grid in general needs significant amount of investment. I think that's part of sort of federal infrastructure plans, and other things are recognizing that. And then it needs further investment to facilitate the build out of renewable energy in a reliable way. So there's a lot of, and I'm assuming you're talking about the grid in general. EWEB's local grid, much of that was built in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so it's at an age where all of that is going to simultaneously aging and needs reinvestment. And that's included in our most recent capital plan to address that. But there's a lot of investment still needed.
So does that mean higher rates, or where are we going to get the money for that capital?
I have a feeling that any kind of energy system that you look at over the next few decades is going to increase in price significantly. I just think that there's a lot of investment to be made. Some of that will be sort of supplemented through federal actions and grants and other things. But I do believe, I think Councilor Surratt said that we were blessed in the Northwest. I think we have historically been blessed with low prices. And I think it really across everywhere, you're going to see significant increases in the cost of energy and the infrastructure to support it.
One last thing, real quick. What is the status?
Greg,
I'm out.
You're way over. So
I'm out.
If there's time for a second round, I'll give it to you.
Okay.
All right, well, I think it's my turn now. And my question is a joint question to Frank and Sarah. Sarah, you haven't had much of a chance to respond. And my question is more of like a policy or a procedural thing. So we've all been given information. We can go kind of ad nauseum with questions. How do we move forward? I feel really strongly in my position at EWEB is that I really want to figure out how to support the city in making sure that CAP 2.0 happens. And I guess we've had these quarterly meetings and we just talk about things a lot. And no disrespect to staff or anything like that, because I know there's a lot of issues and everyone's working really hard. But how do we move forward? What are the things that are like the low-hanging fruit that we can really put our heads together and just knock those out? And then with some of these bigger issues, how do we just not get caught up in asking question after question after question? Because at some point we're going to have to make some decisions. And, you know, we can't conserve our way out of the climate crisis. We can't force people to suddenly buy electric cars. Like, it needs to be something that's more directive policy-wise.
Thank you for that question. I know that's something we've talked a lot about in some of our leadership meetings. And I think for me, it kind of depends on the topic. So in this case, you know, the city council has had a lot of questions about the electrification study and have some conversations coming up around climate and building conservation that I think they're just eager to learn more and more and more. So I think that on some of those bigger topics, it feels like we need to have some kind of a forum like this in order to do that Q&A part before we can kind of move forward. But even on those big ones, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about how staff work really closely together, but I don't know that everybody always knows that. But on something like this, you know, where we're talking about how do we lower carbon in buildings, it's something that would be good for us to actually more, I would say more directly out of the gate, make it really clear we're working together on some of these discussions that are helping inform both sets of policies. And then the smaller knock it out of the park things, I do think some of those things are happening at a staff level. And so maybe it's a matter of communicating that a little bit better, or being really clear about what are those small knock it out of the park requests that we want to move forward. I hope I at least addressed your question.
Yeah, and I guess for Frank on EWEB side, like, if there was a directive from the board that said that we want to align more closely, or we want to work more closely with council in meeting the city's climate goals, like what does the EWEB board need to do to make sure that that kind of aggressively happens?
I think part of that, President Schlossberg, is sort of, there's some informal and formal aspects to that. So EWEB is part of the climate collaborative. We work with the city pretty directly on a number of different measures. I would have to probably be kind of get more of a clear understanding as what the board wanted to look at relative to the climate actions that have sort of been rostered out from the city. The other thing is, I know that we sort of both entities sometimes evaluate decisions or make decisions, or, you know, even consider those things that can affect the other one. You know, I think electrification is an example. It affects the climate and it affects the energy grid, and developing maybe some formality around how some of these questions get answered is, you know, we're actually pretty lucky. There's some cities that have a really combined, very tricky governance relative to the utility system in the city and other branches of the city. And we actually have something that I think could work pretty cleanly. But a lot of these questions, there's not a really very good way of getting getting to the answer of either one entity or another. So I think some formal process around that if the city needed something evaluated or EWEB needed something evaluated, there would be a process to do that.
Great, thank you. That's all that I have.
Okay, Matt.
Thank you, Mayor. And President Schlossberg, thank you for your comments. You said, quote, "We can't force people to buy electric, but in this society, in this community, we can force people to have an account with the fossil fuel industry. Renters in particular have no choice." I know from experience, as Commissioner Borofsky alluded to, my partner and I just rented a new place right here in South Eugene, and are forced to have forced to open an account with the fossil fuel industry. I'm looking at the EWEB residential program summary, and I applaud it, but I see a dearth of requirements in connection to renters. And thank you, Commissioner Borofsky, for recognizing that 50% of our housing stock are renters, with the exception of the the efficiency education program and the home energy score. Are there other avenues you're exploring to reach out to renters? In addition, I see that income qualified customers receive a free kit with energy and water saving products, basic emergency preparedness supplies. What are you doing, if anything, to broaden that footprint so folks of all economic backgrounds can have access to ways to reduce their monthly bill or improve their home comfort and lower their carbon footprint? And in addition, when it comes to rental properties that you're focused on in the home energy score, tenants can choose to send those recommendations to the landlords, and tenants can apply to receive an energy report with recommendations. But what incentives do they have to do so?
So, Councilor Keating, I will fully admit that one of the biggest challenges that we have is incentivizing energy efficiency within rental properties. There are certain rights that a renter has, and there are certain rights that they do not have based on the fact that they actually don't own the property. We would like to encourage whatever can create market pull for landlords to make those investments. Ultimately, the landlord has to make those investments. And so we can have all kinds of incentives around behavior, but the actual incentives to make a permanent change is something that we haven't found a way to effectively, without just supplementing a landlord, found an effective way to do that in the rental market. I think it's a big challenge. I would like to see home energy scores, for example, by the way, expanded not just from sales of homes, but to rentals of homes and rental agreements. But I also think it's a big challenge in the rental market.
Thank you. In my last 8 seconds, is it cheaper to reduce emissions by electrifying new buildings or by retrofitting old buildings with energy efficiency or electrification requirements?
I would just say in general, I think that there is an incredible amount of further potential with energy efficiency and conservation. Just in general, I don't know the direct comparison, but I do believe that there's a lot of headroom that we could do more around efficiency. If the conditions in the grid are what I say, which I think they are, the ability to manage peak through efficiency measures is also there. So I think that it actually creates more incentive. The conditions on the grid create more incentive to do more energy efficiency and conservation as well.
Director Lawson, could EWEB handle an outright ban on new gas hookups?
So the answer to that is the key to that is handle. Like I said, given time, and that we expect adoption wouldn't happen overnight, but we could handle it as EWEB. That isn't the issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. I'm going to let the last counselor speak because I think all the EWEB commissioners had a chance, and that happens to be you, Alan. Well, unless Emily steps up as well.
Thank you, Mayor. I did want to talk about drinking water resiliency, but I was going to get there. I would point out that when I was in graduate school, one of the projects I worked on was a project to improve the weatherization in multifamily housing in at EWEB. So this has been a long-standing issue, since I was in grad school. We've been working on this. So I did appreciate in the report that you guys put together the distinction between the different tests for participant and ratepayers and society. And but most of the impacts that I'm mostly concerned about fall on low-income folk, and electrification poses some enormous equity concerns that we need to be very cognizant of, and not that we say we can't, but we can mitigate for them, but we need to know what they are and the scale of what they are in order to deal with them forthrightly. And as many people have said, we're a city of mostly renters, and a lot of renters are low-income people or energy burdened people, meaning you spend more than 6% of your income on energy. Does the analysis that you guys take that participant and break it down even further into the impacts on low-income parts of the participant class test, or low-income ratepayers, and or on energy burdened people, for both the electricity side and the natural gas side? And if not, is that something that's possible to get out of this analysis?
We did not break down the participant class any further, Counselor. If we did an analysis, it would probably be to try to correlate with the other information that we have just on general participation in limited income programs. We'd probably just do a secondary correlation. It wouldn't necessarily be part of this analysis, but that could be done. I think have quite a bit of data on that.
Yeah, because average results don't necessarily indicate the impact on low-income people. They could be at a disadvantage or an advantage, depending on how much energy they use. If they use less energy, then they could be at an advantage over the average participant. So it'd be really good to see that kind of analysis, because I think that's something we're going to have to deal with as we move forward with electrification.
Yeah, I agree. I think the equity piece also has sort of two sides to that ledger. There's obviously climate equity issues related to climate change, and then there's potential equity concerns with the electrification, which is part of the solution to that. So there's two sides to that ledger that need to be considered, not just the equity of electrification, but the inequities created by climate change.
Okay, thank you. I think we have 2 minutes left, and so I think we probably won't go for a second round. And I'm going to take my moment to just say a few things as we close up. We did not get to water, so I apologize for that. But I expected this to be a robust conversation. I just want to say that I think that Council has created a roadmap in the Climate Action Plan 2.0, and so we want to follow that roadmap. And there are definitely, as I think as Jennifer pointed out, there are a lot of intersections with what EWEB is currently doing and points at which we could make more investment, and certainly on the energy efficiency and certainly on supporting low-income housing. I will say also that as a council, we have a lever, and one of those big levers is that we are pushing hard to create more housing in this community. And it is an opportunity to create more housing that is low carbon, that is electric. And so I think I would be looking for information to build on Matt's questions earlier about, what is that increased load with new housing that comes online as electric. I would be interested in some data that would project that out, because we know that we're trying to increase our housing stock steadily. A lot of that is low income housing. We want it to be efficient. It should be electric if at all possible. And, going forward, I'm comfortable with the idea that it could be a little dirtier and messier in peak times because we're aiming for the future where that would be cleaner in the long term. So I am interested in that. I'm also very interested in some of the other renewables, the wind and solar. We've talked in the past about microgrids and whether we can create microgrids that have some resiliency. And so I am really interested in the way some of those things might also fit into that constellation. I think if we're going to look at pilot projects, we really want to look at those pilot projects that take us, farther away from fossil fuels. And so I very much appreciate the data and acknowledging Mindy's comment that for our council, all that needs to happen for us to decide to move forward that we need more information is our counselors simply need to ask it, direct staff to do that work and come back with a motion. And you have a series of meetings ahead of you that give you that opportunity to say, please go to EWEB and request this information. So I'll just leave you with that thought that there are many opportunities to act on this and have many meetings before you where you will be able to do that. And so apologize for not getting to everyone for a second round, but it is 7:01 and we have another meeting after this. So thank you all very much. And with that, we are adjourned.